This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This Theology Bits video is going to be focusing, as we look into Holy Week, in Good Friday when we think about Jesus' words on the cross. And to really understand this, we have to see the ways in which what Jesus says on the cross is rather dependent on which gospel we're reading. So if we are to compare Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we are going to find Jesus says some strikingly different things. And so in our gospel lesson, we have some very different stories. So I'm going to start with Matthew and Mark because even though I just said it's all very different, in fact, what Jesus' words are on the cross are the same in Matthew and Mark. So we'll use one color to remind ourselves of that, which is the first thing Jesus says is the cry of dereliction. And it's going to be the same thing here, the cry of dereliction. And you're familiar with the cry of dereliction. He says it in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's what we call it, the cry of dereliction. First thing he says. And in fact, in Matthew and Mark, they're the only words he says on the cross. The last thing it says is that with a very loud voice, he gives up his spirit. And that's it. This is all that Jesus says. We'll think about that a little bit more in a moment. But we have a rather different story when we look at Luke and John. In Luke, he says right when he's put on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Very different tone than, my God, why have you forsaken me? Later, we have Jesus being scorned by one of the thieves that are being crucified alongside him, and then being defended by the other. And Jesus says to that thief on the cross, famously, today you will be with me in paradise. Only in Luke is that said. And then, rather than shouting out in a loud voice, we have Jesus saying, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And then it just says, and he breathed his last. Doesn't mention anything about a cry or a loud voice. The Gospel of John's picture is different yet. The first thing that Jesus says is not about any of these people. It's about two of those whom he loves next to him. That is his mother and the beloved, this anonymous disciple, the beloved disciple. Traditionally is identified as John, but I think it's deliberately anonymous to kind of make it an every disciple. Those that follow Jesus all the way to the cross. He says to them, to his mother, woman, behold, this is now your son. And to the beloved disciple, behold, this is now your mother. We'll talk about that in a moment. Then later, Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I thirst. But when he does it, it makes the comment, it's specifically to fulfill Scripture, as if he wasn't really that interested in drinking anything. It was just a comment that needed to be said for fulfillment. And then when Jesus dies, we don't have cry dereliction. Instead, he says, it is finished. These are all the things that Jesus says on the cross. And so some of you might be familiar with the idea of the 7 words from the cross, because if you count it up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it's just the same there, you get 7 words. But look at how different they are compared to Matthew and Mark, to Luke and John. Let's explore why for a moment. Well, first is probably most striking is here on this side with Matthew and Mark. Why does Jesus only say what probably is very bothersome to many of us? My God, why have you abandoned me? Did Jesus doubt his own faith? Well, many people have pointed out he seems to be quoting Psalm 22, which begins with that very line. Much longer psalm about a lament, a very personal lament about the dangers and pitfalls that befall us in this life. And maybe Jesus is simply mentioning this life that he's leading is ending. Others have taken it far more. No, it does mean, in fact, that Jesus dies the way we die, which is to say, in fear. That there can be doubt at the end, and there can be that this is the very human Jesus. Most have looked at it and said, well, the whole picture of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark has been setting him up, Mark and Matthew, as the suffering servant that we met. It's actually in 4 servant songs in Isaiah, but most specifically in Isaiah 53. For surely he has taken on our burdens and our griefs, and wounded for our transgressions. This idea that the role of Jesus as Messiah turns out to be the role of this suffering servant who takes upon himself the wounds to be presented to all people. And so then you end up with a theology of atonement for wrongs elsewhere, but also a conquering the power of death. See, they all expected Messiah to come in and conquer the problems they were facing. But Jesus flips it, especially in Mark 13, right before he's crucified, that the issues that they need to deal with was not actually the Roman Empire, but a much bigger problem. That is the force of death in this world. And so when Jesus calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus has taken on death, and then with the resurrection conquers death. And so many have said, well, this is a theology that then fits with what Jesus says on the cross. Now, then is very different than what we have in the Gospel of Luke. We have these 3 statements of Luke. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Today, you will be in paradise. Notice they're about other people. They're not about Jesus. And then Jesus does, when he's going to die, says, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit, presenting a very different idea. Well, there's a few things going on. One thing in the Gospel of Luke is Jesus is being shown to be legally completely innocent. This is in the Roman centurion who in the Matthew and Mark, when he sees Jesus die, says, truly, this was the Son of God. But here in Luke, he doesn't say that. He says, truly, this man was innocent. The only gospel that says that. It's an emphasis throughout. Not only is he innocent, he's forgiving these other people who are doing this to him. He looks at this person, this thief, who is very much a rightly being punished for a wrongful act, who simply says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And for that one act of faith, Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. And so you have Jesus not only as innocent, but also as someone who forgives. That the cross is tied to forgiveness, to welcome other people. This thief who seems to have no relationship with Jesus before, but just with that one word has now been welcomed, and welcomed ultimately into paradise. Not just there have a temporary welcome, but a permanent one. And then we finally have Jesus being set up as an innocent martyr. And this matters for the audience of the Gospel of Luke, which does seem to be written for a community that is being persecuted and maybe does have some martyrs present. So a very different theology that's reflected in what Jesus says. Now, in the Gospel of John, we have a wildly different story. The first thing about it is this last statement. It is finished. It doesn't mean just it's concluded, but that nothing's left out. It's completed. There is nothing left in the whole world, the whole cosmos. Oh, I started writing in Greek there, sorry. The whole cosmos that has been left dangling. It's all been accomplished. That's what the cross does. When Jesus dies, it is Jesus's glorification in Mark. This is a moment of power, not one of suffering. And it still does the same thing of conquering the power of death, but in a totally different way. And so when he says it's finished, this is a moment of triumph. This has accomplished something greater than just the power of death, but all things in the world. It's all been put into place. What's more, how does that relate to us? Well, I mentioned this anonymous disciple is kind of an every person, that it is a stand-in for you, the disciple of Jesus, who follows Jesus all the way to see him on the cross. That what kind of unity is there between Jesus and his followers? Well, Jesus has made these comments before, that I am in you and you are in me. That there is mystical unity between Jesus and his followers, that you and he will be so united that you could even say Jesus' mother is your mother. Wildly different kind of theology. Then we have, and by the way, it was all according to plan in the first place, that this is fulfilling something that was already set in place. And so we have a panoply of different voices that are presenting different things. And as we look at these different gospels, each of these details emphasize different things. Jesus' theology is big, and it covers a lot of things all at once. And one of the gifts we have of having four gospels is that it emphasizes different things for us at different times when we need to hear that. When we need on Good Friday one year to see Jesus in glory and power, even though it's counterintuitive, we can look to the Gospel of John. When we, by contrast, need to recognize that Jesus really is there with us in our suffering and in our death, that Jesus accompanies us, not just as a powerful figure who almost seems unaffected by this world, we have the Gospel of Mark. When we need to see that Jesus is the good God we believe in, that can do no harm to us, but only benefit, we have the Gospel of Luke. And so we have different pictures, different theologies, all written for you, for what you need to hear on any particular day. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.